Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was shisui uchiha reincarnation. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. All men are not created equal. It was a harsh, immutable truth of the world, a bitter pill forced down the throat of society over a century ago, when the first glowing baby was born in Qingqing City. Since that day, the scales of humanity had tipped, shattered, and reformed into a hierarchy dictated entirely by genetic lottery. Izuku Midoriya learned this truth when he was 4 years old, sitting in a sterile doctor's office with a grinning all-might action figure clutched in his small, trembling hands. He remembered the cold dismissal in the doctor's eyes, the clinical tone as he pointed to the X-ray of Izuku's foot, the presence of an extra joint in his pinky toe. A vestige of an evolutionary past, a definitive, undeniable mark of obsolescence. You should probably give it up. 6 years had passed since that day. 6 years of watching the world move on without him. At 10 years old, Izuku was intimately familiar with the cruel mechanics of his reality. He lived in a world of gods and monsters, of soaring heroes and towering villains, while he was shackled to the earth, profoundly and painfully ordinary. Yet, despite the extra joint in his toe, despite the lack of a quirk factor in his blood, Izuku always felt different. It wasn't something he could ever explain to his mother, Inko, who already looked at him with enough heartbreak to drown a city. Nor could he explain it to his teachers, who saw him as a fragile glass ornament that was better left ignored. And he certainly couldn't explain it to Katsuki Bakugo. It was a phantom sensation. A ghost of a feeling that hovered just at the edge of his consciousness. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of things that didn't belong to him. A towering structure of red wood. A sprawling compound bearing a crest shaped like a fan, painted in red and white. A sky painted the color of blood, and the pain. Every so often, a sudden, blinding ache would spike behind his right eye. It felt like a phantom limb, an echo of a violent trauma he had never experienced. He would rub his eye until it watered, dismissing it as eye strain from reading too many hero forums or writing in his endlessly expanding hero analysis for the future notebooks. He convinced himself it was just his imagination. His mind's desperate, pathetic way of pretending he was special. The late afternoon sun bled through the windows of Aldera Elementary, casting long, bruised shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. The final bell had rung 10 minutes ago, but Izuku remained at his desk, his yellow backpack sitting limply by his feet. His head was bowed over a fresh notebook, number 6 in his series, his pencil flying across the page as he sketched the Pro-Hero Crust Shield mechanics. Hey Deku! Izuku's pencil snapped. The sound was sharp, echoing loudly in the nearly empty classroom. He froze, his shoulders tensing instinctively as the familiar scent of burnt sugar and ozone drifted into his airspace. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Katsuki Bakugo stood at the front of his desk, flanked by 2 of his usual sycophants, a boy with elongated, reptilian fingers, and another with leathery, bat-like wings folded against his back. Katsuki's crimson eyes glared down at him, devoid of the childish camaraderie they had shared years ago. There was only annoyance, superiority, and a volatile, simmering aggression. I thought I told you to stay out of my way today, Katsuki drawled, his voice carrying that characteristic rough edge. He leaned over, snatching the notebook out from under Izuku's hands before Izuku could even think to protest. Keikaken, please give that back, Izuku stammered, his voice betraying him with a slight tremble. He reached out, but Katsuki casually held it out of reach, flipping it open with a sneer. Hero analysis for the future? Katsuki read the cover aloud, his lips curling into a vicious grin. The 2 lackeys behind him snickered. Are you still delusional, Deku? You're quirkless, a pebble on the side of the road. You really think scribbling in a little diary is going to make you a hero? I just want to learn, Izuku said, forcing himself to meet Katsuki's gaze. There's no rule that says I can't try. Try? Katsuki's voice dropped, a dangerous, low rumble. Small, warning pops of nitroglycerin sparked across his palms. You trying is an insult to people who actually have what it takes. You're just gonna get yourself killed, and make the rest of us look bad for knowing you. Before Izuku could form a response, Katsuki slammed his palms together, sandwiching the notebook between them. A loud crack echoed through the room, accompanied by a flash of heat and light. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Izuku watched in horror as his notebook, hours of meticulous work, was singed, blackened, and warped by the explosion. Katsuki tossed the smoking ruin over his shoulder. It fluttered pitifully before landing in a nearby trash can. Know your place, Deku, Katsuki scoffed, turning on his heel. Come on, guys. Let's go to the arcade. Breathing the same air as him is making me sick. Izuku sat perfectly still, his hands trembling in his lap. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt the familiar, hot prickle of tears in the corners of his eyes, but he aggressively blinked them away. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not anymore. Slowly, methodically, he stood up. He walked over to the trash can, reached in, and pulled out his ruined notebook. The pages were fused together at the edges, the cover charred beyond recognition. He brushed off the ash, carefully placed it into his yellow backpack, and walked out of the classroom. The walk home from school was usually a sanctuary for Izuku. It was a time to decompress, to watch the city move, to look for pro-heroes on patrol. But today, the air felt heavy, suffocating. His route took him through a sprawling municipal park on the edge of Muzurifu. It was a lush, overgrown area, bordered by a steep, rocky embankment that dropped sharply into a deep, fast-flowing river. The locals called it the Naka River, though Izuku never quite knew why. The trees here grew thick, their canopies interlocking to filter the sunlight into a dim, verdant twilight. Izuku walked along the paved path near the embankment, the roaring of the river below providing a white noise that usually calmed his racing thoughts. Today, however, it only amplified his anxiety. Why do I even try? He thought bitterly, kicking a stray pebble off the path. It skittered over the edge, tumbling down the rocky incline until it vanished into the frothing water below. Kaken is right. I don't have a quirk. I'm not strong. I'm not fast. I'm just me. Suddenly, the phantom pain struck. Izuku gasped, stumbling forward as an agonizing spike of pressure blossomed behind his right eye. He pressed the heel of his palm against his face, his breath itching. It was sharper this time, infinitely more intense than ever before. It felt as though someone was physically reaching into his skull, trying to pry his eye from its socket. Ah! Izuku groaned, falling to his knees on the pavement. Leave the rest to you. A voice. It wasn't his own. It was older, smoother, laced with an unfathomable depth of sorrow and an unwavering, quiet resolve. It echoed through the caverns of his mind, vibrating against his very soul. My friend, who's there? Izuku wheezed, his vision blurring. He squeezed his left eye shut, his right still covered by his hand. The world around him seemed to warp. The roaring of the river below suddenly sounded different. It didn't sound like the municipal water of Muzurifu. It sounded wilder. Older. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind him. Well. Look who's crying on the ground. Izuku's breath caught. He forced his eye open, his vision swimming with tears and a bizarre, reddish tint. Through the blur, he saw 3 figures standing over him. Katsuki, and his 2 followers. They must have taken the shortcut through the park to get to the arcade. I'm not crying, Izuku managed to say, though his voice cracked humiliatingly. He tried to stand up, but his equilibrium was completely shattered by the throbbing in his skull. Still as pathetic as ever, Katsuki sneered, stepping closer. The shadow of the explosive boy fell over Izuku. What's wrong with you? Throwing a tantrum because I burned your little diary? And no, Izuku stammered, backing away slightly. His heel met the very edge of the paved path. Just beyond the grass was the steep, 50-foot drop down the rocky embankment to the raging river. My head, it just hurts. You're making excuses, Katsuki growled, his patience evaporating as it always did. He took another step forward, sparks igniting in his right hand. I'm sick of looking at you, Deku. I'm sick of the way you look at me, like you think you're somehow on my level. You're nothing. Don't let the clan. The voice echoed again. The phantom pain flared so violently that Izuku let out a breathless scream, his hands clutching his head. The scenery before him fractured. For a terrifying, disorienting second, Katsuki's face was replaced by someone else. An older man. His right arm was wrapped in heavy bandages, his face heavily scarred, his singular visible eye burning with a greedy, parasitic hunger. Danzo. A name Izuku didn't know bubbled to the surface of his mind. "Stop it!" Izuku yelled, though he didn't know if he was yelling at Katsuki, the hallucination, or the agonizing voice in his head. Katsuki, insulted by the outburst, scowled deeply. "Don't tell me what to do, you quirkless nobody!" Katsuki lunged forward, his palm outstretched, aiming a warning explosion right in front of Izuku's face to scare him. It was a bully's tactic, meant to intimidate, meant to make Izuku flinch and cower. But Izuku was already completely overwhelmed. The flash of light and the sudden, searing heat of the explosion triggered something deep within his cellular memory. In Izuku's mind, he wasn't standing in a park in Muzurifu. He was standing in a darkened forest. A hand was plunging toward his face, fingers hooked like talons, tearing into his flesh, ripping away his right eye. Izuku flinched violently, stepping backward to avoid the phantom hand and the very real explosion. His foot found nothing but empty air. Time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. Izuku felt the sudden, terrifying absence of gravity. He saw Katsuki's face shift from anger to genuine shock, the blonde boy's hand reaching out instinctively, but missing by inches. He saw the canopy of the trees receding, the blue sky peeking through the leaves. And then, he was falling. The drop was steep, a jagged cliff face of rock and roots. Izuku tumbled, his small body scraping against the stones. The rushing sound of the river rose up to meet him, a roaring beast waiting to swallow him whole. As he plummeted, the trauma of the fall tore the final barrier in his mind to shreds. The migraine shattered, and a floodgate broke open. Memories that were not his own violently overlaid his current reality. It wasn't a gentle recollection, it was an avalanche. He was older. He wore a dark blue shirt with a high collar, the fan-shaped crest proudly displayed on his back. A short sword was strapped to his shoulder. He was moving through trees at impossible speeds, leaving afterimages in his wake. He was laughing with a younger boy, a boy with lines under his dark eyes. Itachi. His brother in all but blood. He was standing before a council, begging for peace, offering to use his ultimate power, Kodo Amatsukami, to stop a bloody civil war. He was betrayed. Poisoned. Ambushed. He was standing on the edge of the Naka River, the real Naka River. He reached up, plunging his fingers into his own left eye socket. The agonizing pop. Handing his remaining eye to Itachi. "I leave the rest to you." And then, he leaned backward, letting gravity take him. Falling into the rushing water below. Welcoming the darkness. Izuku Midoriya was falling into the river. Shisui Uchiha was falling into the river. The two souls, separated by dimensions, by time, by the very fabric of reality, slammed together like tectonic plates. The modern child who wanted to save everyone with a smile, and the ancient shinobi who had sacrificed everything to protect from the shadows. They were not two different people. Not anymore. The reincarnation cycle was complete. The lock was broken. Izuku's eyes snapped open mid-fall. The panic of the 10-year-old boy vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, crystalline focus of an elite jonin. The world, which had been a terrifying blur of motion, suddenly snapped into razor-sharp clarity. He could see every droplet of water spraying from the river below, the trajectory of every jagged rock on the cliff face. Deep within his core, something ignited. It was not a quirk factor. It was not a genetic mutation. It was something older, something fundamental. A wellspring of physical stamina and spiritual energy, perfectly intertwined. Chakra. It flared to life like a dormant volcano. It didn't burn him. It felt like a warm, comforting blanket wrapping around his very soul. It surged through pathways in his body that had laid dormant for a decade, flooding his limbs with impossible strength and weightlessness. 30 feet to the water, Izuku twisted his body in midair. The clumsy, flailing limbs of a panicked child transformed into the fluid, aerodynamic grace of a predator. He righted himself, feet pointed downward. 10 feet. Instinctively, without a single conscious thought, Izuku routed the surging chakra down through his legs, pooling it at the soles of his battered red sneakers. He envisioned the energy like a solid platform, a repulsive force meant to counteract the liquid below. Impact. He didn't sink. There was no massive splash. There was no desperate flailing against the current. Izuku hit the surface of the raging river, and a sharp crack echoed over the rushing water, like a whip striking a drum. The water beneath his feet depressed slightly, rippling outward in violent concentric circles from the sheer force of his deceleration. But he stood firm. Izuku Midoriya, 10 years old and officially registered as quirkless, was standing on the surface of a fast-moving river. Above him, on the edge of the cliff, he could faintly hear the panicked, distant shouts of Katsuki and the others. They were screaming his name, likely believing they had just murdered him, but their voices sounded so far away, so insignificant compared to the storm raging inside his own head. Izuku slowly opened his eyes. The phantom pain was entirely gone. In its place was a sensation of raw, thrumming power, a cool energy that rested comfortably behind his corneas. He looked down at his feet. The water rushed past his red shoes, but he remained perfectly stationary, his chakra anchoring him to the liquid surface like it was solid concrete. He watched the ripples of the water, and then, he looked at his own reflection. The boy looking back at him was Izuku Midoriya. He had the same mess of unruly green hair, the same round face, the same freckles dusting his cheeks, but his eyes were no longer emerald green, they were a deep, piercing crimson. And surrounding the pupil of each eye, resting on a thin black ring, was a single, dark comma-shaped mark. Atomo, the Sharingan. Izuku stared at his reflection for a long time. The rushing of the river filled the silence. He raised a trembling hand, brushing his fingers against his cheek, right below his eye. The reflection mimicked the movement. A tear escaped, sliding down his cheek and dripping into the river below. But he wasn't crying out of fear. He was crying out of a profound, overwhelming grief that wasn't entirely his own. He mourned for a clan he had never met, for a best friend forced to slaughter his own family, for a village hidden in leaves. But beneath the grief, there was an unshakable resolve. Shisui, Izuku thought, the name echoing in the quiet chambers of his mind. That was my name. No, another part of his mind corrected. The part that worshipped All Might, the part that loved his mother, the part that wanted to be a hero who saved people with a smile. My name is Izuku Midoriya. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The air filled his lungs, smelling of damp earth and moss. When he opened his eyes again, the conflict within him had settled. The two halves of his soul had seamlessly merged, integrating into a single, cohesive consciousness. He was Izuku Midoriya. But he possessed the memories, the skills, and the will of fire of Shisui Uchiha. I'm alive, Izuku whispered, his voice steady, devoid of its usual stutter. The tone was slightly deeper, carrying a calm maturity that belonged to a man who had seen war and death. He looked up toward the cliff. He could hear Katsuki arguing with his lackeys, panic lacing the explosive boy's usually confident voice. We have to call someone. We have to find him. Izuku felt a flicker of annoyance, but it was quickly washed away by a calm, analytical detachment. He didn't want to deal with them right now. He didn't want to explain how he survived a 50-foot drop, or why his eyes were suddenly red. He needed time. Time to understand this chakra flowing through his veins, time to process the lifetime of memories he had just inherited. With a subtle shift of his chakra, Izuku turned away from the cliff. He didn't walk to the shore. Instead, he bent his knees slightly, channeling a burst of chakra to his feet. He remembered the technique. The Shunshin no Jutsu. The body flicker. It had been his signature. It was what earned him his moniker, Shisui of the body flicker. His current body was weak. It lacked the muscle density, the training, the physical conditioning of his past life. He couldn't perform the jutsu perfectly, not yet. But he didn't need to cross a battlefield. He just needed to disappear. Izuku formed a single half-rammed seal with his right hand. A gust of wind swirled around him, kicking up a spray of mist from the river's surface. In the blink of an eye, the boy was gone. All that remained was a handful of green leaves, plucked from the overhanging branches by the sheer velocity of his departure, fluttering gently down to rest upon the churning water. Several miles away, in the quiet, residential district where the Midoriya apartment complex stood, a sudden blur of motion materialized in a dark alleyway adjacent to the building. Izuku stumbled forward out of the displacement, his sneakers scraping loudly against the asphalt. He hit the brick wall of the alley, gasping for breath, his legs shaking violently. The backlash of using chakra for the first time, combined with the immense physical strain of the body flicker on his untrained 10-year-old muscles, hit him like a freight train. His lungs burned, and his head spun. He leaned against the cool brick, sliding down until he was sitting on the ground, his knees pulled to his chest. He closed his eyes, and the crimson hue of the Sharingan slowly faded, retreating back into the familiar, safe emerald green. The exhaustion was absolute, but as he sat there in the shadows of the alley, Izuku couldn't help but smile. For the first time in his life, the oppressive weight of the word quirkless didn't crush him. Society told him he was powerless, a glitch in the next stage of human evolution. But they were wrong. He wasn't the next stage of evolution. He was a remnant of something far older, and far more powerful. A hero, Izuku thought, looking down at his small, trembling hands. He clenched them into fists, feeling the lingering warmth of chakra thrumming beneath his skin. I can still be a hero, but the memories of shisui Uchiha whispered a warning in his ear. The path of a hero, much like the path of a shinobi, was paved with sacrifice, pain, and blood. The power he wielded was born from tragedy. The eyes he possessed were a curse as much as they were a blessing. If he was going to walk this path, he couldn't afford to be the naive, weeping boy who let Katsuki Bakugo walk all over him. He had to be smarter. He had to be faster. He had to be a shadow that protected the light. Izuku pushed himself off the ground, his legs wobbling but holding firm. He dusted off his pants, adjusted the straps of his yellow backpack, and walked out of the alley toward his apartment building. His mother was waiting for him. He would smile for her. He would be the sweet, innocent boy she loved. He would hide this power until his body was ready to bear its weight. But as Izuku Midoriya looked up at the setting sun, casting long, fiery shadows over the city of Mizurufu, the emerald green of his eyes flashed, just for a fraction of a second, to a bleeding crimson. The will of fire had been reignited. And the world of heroes was entirely unprepared for the phantom that had just been born. To hold two lives within a single mind is to exist in a state of perpetual twilight. It is a balancing act between the ghost of a blood-soaked past and the fragile promise of a bright future. For Izuku Midoriya, the 4 years following his fall into the Naka River were a quiet, invisible metamorphosis. Society looked at him and saw the same boy they always had, small, unremarkable, quirkless. A rounding error in a superhuman world. But beneath the surface, behind the emerald green of his eyes, a profound alchemical reaction was taking place. The soul of a modern, hero-obsessed teenager was intertwining with the battle-hardened, self-sacrificing spirit of an elite shinobi. They did not fight for dominance. There was no internal war. Shisui Uchiha had been a man of deep compassion, a pacifist who abhorred the senseless violence of his era. He had wielded his blade not for glory, but to protect the innocent from the shadows. Izuku Midoriya was a boy who simply wanted to save people with a smile, to be a pillar of hope in the sunlight. Their philosophies did not clash. They locked together like two halves of a complex puzzle. Izuku's boundless empathy softened the sharp, cynical edges of the shinobi's memories, while Shisui's tactical genius and emotional discipline fortified the trembling, anxious heart of the bullied boy. By the time Izuku turned 14, he was no longer a victim. He was a weapon resting quietly in its sheath. The smell of rust, rotting kelp, and salt air clung heavily to the pre-dawn fog at Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. It was an illegal dumping ground, a sprawling, metallic graveyard of forgotten appliances, crushed cars, and shattered glass. To the residents of Mizurufu, it was an eyesore. To Izuku, it was the perfect dojo. The sun had not yet breached the horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of violet and indigo. Izuku stood at the shoreline, the cold tide washing over his bare feet. He wore a pair of worn-out athletic shorts and a simple, sweat-drenched gray t-shirt. His green hair had grown out slightly over the years, wild and unruly, framing a face that had lost its baby fat, replaced by the sharp, focused jawline of a disciplined athlete. He closed his eyes, his breathing slow and metronomic. Inhale. Draw the physical stamina from the cells. Exhale. Bind it with the spiritual energy of the mind. It was the fundamental equation of his existence. Chakra. A concept utterly alien to the quirk-dominated society of modern Japan, yet deeply, intrinsically mapped onto Izuku's soul. He opened his eyes. The world shifted. The muted morning light sharpened into agonizing clarity. In the reflection of a broken mirror resting against a nearby pile of tires, a single, black kama-shaped tomo spun lazily around his blood-red pupils. The Sharingan. The eye that reflects the heart. Even after 4 years, the activation of the dojutsu still sent a cold, electric thrill down his spine. It was a sensory overload that he had learned to filter. With the Sharingan active, he could see the microscopic stress fractures in the rusted metal around him. He could track the erratic, frantic flight of a seagull 100 yards away in slow motion. He could see the subtle, pulsing flow of his own chakra mapping out his circulatory system. Izuku stepped forward. His bare foot did not break the surface of the dark ocean water. Instead, a faint, almost invisible blue aura flared between his skin and the liquid. He stepped again. And again. Soon, he was walking smoothly over the rolling waves, 50 feet out from the shoreline. The ocean was not like the river. It was unpredictable, turbulent, completely beholden to the pull of the moon and the shifting tides. It required constant, micro-adjustments of chakra just to stay afloat. A single lapse in concentration, a single stray thought, and the surface tension would break, plunging him into the freezing depths. It had taken him 2 years of drowning to master it. Now, it was as natural as breathing. Standing on the water, Izuku shifted his stance. He brought his hands up to his chest, his fingers blurring through a series of complex seals that felt etched into his muscle memory. Tiger. Ram. Monkey. Boar. Horse. Tiger. He inhaled deeply, drawing a massive pocket of air into his lungs. Simultaneously, he routed a dense coil of chakra up from his stomach, pulling it into his chest cavity and superheating it. The sensation was terrifying, like swallowing a lit coal. It required immense pain tolerance, a trait Shisui's memories provided in abundance. Izuku brought 2 fingers to his lips. Fire style, great fireball jutsu. He exhaled. A continuous stream of hypercondensed fire erupted from his mouth, expanding instantly into a massive, roaring sphere of orange and white flame. The intense heat instantly vaporized the ocean water beneath him, creating a thick, hissing cloud of steam. The fireball illuminated the dark beach, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the towers of trash. Izuku cut the flow of chakra, gasping as the flames dissipated into the fog. He coughed, rubbing his throat. It felt raw, almost blistered. He let the Sharingan fade, the crimson bleeding back into emerald green, and dropped to his knees on the water's surface, panting heavily. Still too weak, Izuku muttered to himself, splashing some of the cold seawater onto his face to cool his flushed skin. He had the knowledge. He had the technique. He even had a moderate, steadily growing pool of chakra. But his physical vessel, the biology of Izuku Midoriya, was a massive bottleneck. The great fireball jutsu was a C-rank technique, standard for any uchiha. Shisui could have launched 3 in rapid succession without breaking a sweat. For Izuku, a single, moderately sized fireball nearly scorched his own trachea and drained a quarter of his reserves. His body simply wasn't built for war. It was the body of a normal, 14-year-old civilian. He deactivated his surface walking, allowing himself to sink into the freezing ocean water. The shock of the cold was a welcome relief against his overheated muscles. He swam back to shore with smooth, powerful strokes, his mind racing with calculations and analysis. He had kept his abilities an absolute secret. In this society, possessing an undocumented ability was a fast track to being labeled a vigilante, or a villain. If he claimed it was a quirk, the registry would test him. They would find no quirk factor. They would ask questions about the fire, about the red eyes, about the physical enhancements. It would draw the eyes of the government, of scientists, and inevitably of villains. He had to remain a ghost. Until he was strong enough to stand in the light, he would operate in the shadows. He would be the phantom that guarded the alleyways. Izuku dragged himself onto the sandy shore, wringing out his shirt. He looked toward the sprawling skyline of Mizudafu as the sun finally broke over the buildings, bathing the city in a warm, golden glow. Today was the last semester of middle school. The career aptitude test was today. It was time to face a different kind of battlefield. Aldera Junior High was a microcosm of a society obsessed with power. It was a place where worth was determined by the flashiness of one's genetics, and where the quirkless were relegated to the very bottom of the food chain. Izuku sat quietly at his desk near the back of the classroom. To the casual observer, he looked like the same timid boy he had always been. He was hunched slightly over his notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, his pencil sketching out a detailed breakdown of the pro-hero Kamui Wood's preemptive capture tactics. But a trained eye would notice the subtle differences. His posture, though seemingly relaxed, was perfectly balanced. His feet were planted firmly on the floor, ready to spring. His breathing was so shallow and rhythmic it barely registered. And though he was looking at his notebook, his peripheral vision was tracking every single movement in the room. He knew exactly when the teacher's eyes darted toward the clock. He noted the slight, nervous twitch in the jaw of the boy sitting 2 desks ahead. And most importantly, he felt the heavy, suffocating aura of aggression radiating from the blond boy sitting near the front. Katsuki Bakugo had his feet kicked up on his desk, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Over the past 4 years, their dynamic had shifted in a way that infuriated Bakugo to his very core. In the beginning, Bakugo had relentlessly targeted Izuku, expecting the familiar tears, the flinching, the desperate apologies. But the tears had stopped. Izuku no longer cowered. He didn't fight back, he never threw a punch, never raised his voice, but he didn't submit either. He just looked at him. Izuku would look at Bakugo with a calm, impossibly deep gaze that made the explosive boy feel like he was being dissected under a microscope. It was a look that communicated a terrifying, silent truth. I am not afraid of you anymore. That lack of fear drove Bakugo to madness. So, the homeroom teacher began, slapping a stack of papers against his podium. As third-year students, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures. I'm handing out printouts for your desired career paths. The teacher paused, a wry smile crossing his face. He suddenly tossed the papers into the air. But who am I kidding? You're all planning on entering the hero course, aren't you? The classroom erupted into cheers. Students activated their quirks, showing off glowing hands, extending limbs, and minor elemental manipulations. It was a cacophony of adolescent pride. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, the teacher sighed, waving his hands to settle them down. But remember, it's against the rules to use them during school hours. Sensei! A rough, arrogant voice cut through the noise. Bakugo leaned back in his chair, a smirk practically carved into his face. Don't lump me in with these background characters. I'm not going to be stuck at the bottom with the rest of these rejects. The class immediately broke into angry murmurs, but Bakugo just laughed, small sparks popping across his knuckles. You all have weak, pathetic quirks. You'd be lucky to end up as sidekicks to some D-lister. I'm the only one in this dump who has what it takes. Bakugo slammed his hand on his desk, standing up. I aced the mock tests. I'm going to be the only student from this mediocre school to get into UA High. I'm going to surpass All Might himself and become the top hero. Oh, right, the teacher said, adjusting his glasses. Bakugo, you are aiming for UA High, aren't you? The classroom fell silent. UA was the pinnacle. The acceptance rate was abysmal. To even apply was a statement of immense confidence. Oh, Midoriya, the teacher added casually, flipping through his clipboard. Didn't you also apply for UA? The silence stretched for a single, agonizing second. And then, the room exploded in laughter. Midoriya? No way. You can't get into the hero course just by studying, idiot. He's quirkless. What's he gonna do, aggressively read at the villains? Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't look up from his notebook. He simply continued to sketch, his hand moving with mechanical precision. He let the mockery wash over him like water off a stone. They only see what society tells them to see, Izuku thought, his internal voice carrying the calm cadence of shisui. Illusion is the foundation of all shinobi tactics. Let them believe I am nothing. But the laughter was suddenly cut short by a deafening crash. Bakugo had vaulted over the desks, landing directly in front of Izuku. Before Izuku could blink, Bakugo's palms slammed flat onto the surface of Izuku's desk, detonating a localized explosion. The blast incinerated the top layer of the wood and sent a shockwave of heat and smoke directly into Izuku's face. In the past, Izuku would have fallen backward out of his chair, screaming. Today, as the smoke cleared, Izuku was still sitting there. He hadn't even blinked. The only movement was the gentle flutter of his green hair settling back against his forehead. His eyes, fixed on Bakugo, were terrifyingly calm. Listen to me, Deku, Bakugo snarled, his face inches from Izuku's. The smell of burnt caramel was nauseating. Forget the crappy quirks of these extras. You are completely quirkless. You are a biological defect. If you think you can stand in the same arena as me, I will literally end you. Izuku slowly set his pencil down. He looked up, his emerald eyes locking onto Bakugo's crimson ones. He didn't activate the Sharingan, but he didn't need to. Through the lens of his past life, he could read Bakugo like an open book. The flared nostrils, the tension in the jaw, the microscopic tremor in his detonating hand, it wasn't just rage. It was insecurity. It was the desperate, clawing need to maintain a superiority that he felt was slipping away. Yui removed the rule against quirkless applicants years ago, Katsuki, Izuku said. His voice was quiet, even, and completely devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a hostage negotiator speaking to a man standing on a ledge. I'm not trying to compete with you. I'm just following my own path. Your path leads to a body bag. Bakugo roared, grabbing Izuku by the collar of his uniform. You don't get a path. You stay in the dirt where you belong. Bakugo, that's enough. Sit down, the teacher finally half-heartedly intervened, clearly not wanting to deal with the paperwork of a physical altercation. Bakugo sneered, holding Izuku's gaze for one more second before shoving him backward and storming off to his desk. Izuku quietly adjusted his collar. He picked up his pencil and resumed his sketching. He's a volatile asset, Izuku analyzed internally. Immense raw power, sharp battle instincts, but absolutely zero emotional regulation. In a shinobi squad, he would be a liability. In this society, he is prime hero material. The parameters for heroism are dangerously skewed. The final bell rang, signaling the end of the day. The students scrambled to pack their bags and escape. Izuku took his time, meticulously organizing his notebooks. He preferred to leave last to avoid the crowded hallways. He slung his yellow backpack over his shoulder and walked out into the empty corridor. The late afternoon sun cast long, orange geometric shadows across the linoleum floor. Hey! Defect. Izuku stopped. He didn't turn around. He could hear the heavy, aggressive footsteps approaching from the stairwell. Bakugo, flanked by his two usual followers, stepped into the hallway, blocking Izuku's path to the exit. I wasn't finished talking to you in there, Bakugo said, cracking his knuckles. The two boys behind him snickered, clearly expecting a show. You've been getting real cocky lately, Deku, looking at me with those dead, creepy eyes. You think you've figured something out? You think you're better than me? Izuku let out a slow, quiet breath. Conflict is unavoidable. Diffusing tactics have failed. I don't think I'm better than you, Katsuki, Izuku said, finally turning to face them. I just don't see the point in this anymore. We aren't kids. Bullying me isn't going to make your quirk any stronger. Let it go. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. To Bakugo, the calm, rational, almost pitying tone was the ultimate insult. It wasn't just defiance, it was condescension. The quirkless pebble was speaking to him like an adult lecturing a toddler. A vein bulged violently in Bakugo's forehead. Let it go. I'll show you what I can let go of. Bakugo lunged. It was a fast, brutal attack. He didn't telegraph it with a wide swing. He stepped into Izuku's guard, his right hand crackling with a massive, concentrated explosion aimed squarely at Izuku's chest. For a 14-year-old, Bakugo's combat speed was genuinely impressive, but to Izuku, it looked like he was moving underwater. Izuku didn't panic. He didn't brace for impact. He simply let his instincts take the wheel. Chakra flared in his system, an instantaneous spike of energy that flooded his nervous system. He routed a minuscule fraction of it to his feet. Shunshin. Bakugo's palm struck Izuku squarely in the chest. A loud boom echoed through the hallway, smoke obscuring the area. Bakugo grinned viciously. expecting to hear the satisfying thud of Izuku hitting the lockers. But there was no resistance. His hand just passed right through. The image of Izuku Midoriya flickered, wavered like a mirage over hot asphalt, and then dissolved into thin air. What the? Bakugo stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him through the phantom afterimage. He caught himself, whipping his head around in absolute bewilderment. His two lackeys were standing with their jaws unhinged, staring blankly at the spot where Izuku had just been. Looking for me? Bakugo spun around. Izuku was standing exactly 10 feet behind them, at the far end of the hallway near the exit doors. He hadn't broken a sweat. His posture was perfectly relaxed. To anyone else, it looked like he had teleported. How? Bakugo breathed, his crimson eyes wide with shock. How did you get over there? What did you do? I stepped out of the way, Izuku said calmly. It was technically true. High-speed movement was just a matter of applying force to the ground. Like I said, Katsuki. I'm not fighting you. Have a good evening. Izuku turned and pushed open the exit doors, disappearing into the blinding afternoon sunlight, leaving Katsuki Bakugo standing in the quiet hallway, trembling with a mixture of raw fury and unprecedented, gnawing doubt. The walk home was a sobering experience. Izuku took the long route, avoiding the main streets. As soon as he was out of sight of the school, he leaned against a brick wall in a secluded alleyway, his breathing hitching slightly. He rolled up his right pant leg, inspecting his calf. The muscle was twitching violently, spasming under the skin. A dark, ugly bruise was already beginning to form beneath the surface. The body flicker, Izuku analyzed, pressing his thumb against the bruised muscle to massage the knot. It's an optical illusion created by sheer velocity. In my past life, my muscles were conditioned to handle the sudden burst of acceleration and the instantaneous deceleration. In this body, tearing microfibers in my calves just to move 10 feet. He let out a frustrated sigh, sliding down the brick wall until he was crouching on the pavement. He was incredibly fast, yes. If pushed, he could likely activate his Sharingan and read the movements of nearly any villain on the street. He could use genjutsu to paralyze an opponent's mind, or fire style to control a battlefield. But it wasn't enough. Shisui Uchiha had been an assassin, a skirmisher, a man who fought from the shadows to end conflicts before they began. He relied on lethality, on striking the vital points and disappearing. But Izuku didn't want to be an assassin. He didn't want to slit throats in the dark. He looked up at the sky, watching a commercial jet leave a white contrail across the blue expanse. He wanted to be like All Might. He wanted to be the symbol of peace. To do that, he had to stand in the light. He had to be a visible, unshakable pillar that villains feared and civilians rallied behind. He couldn't just dodge forever. If a villain threw a bus full of civilians, a genjutsu wouldn't catch the bus. If a building was collapsing, high-speed movement wouldn't hold up the rubble. To save everyone with a smile, to truly carry the will of fire into the modern era, he needed more than just parlor tricks and assassinations tactics. He needed raw, overwhelming, undeniable power. Izuku clenched his fist, ignoring the dull ache in his leg. He had 10 months until the UA entrance exam. He had 10 months to push this frail, civilian vessel past its breaking point and forge it into something capable of holding the legacy of the Uchiha and the dream of a hero. He stood up, his emerald eyes burning with a quiet, terrifying intensity. I need a stronger body. I need to lift more than trash. I need a foundation. The phantoms of his past had given him the blueprint. Now, it was time to build the fire. Izuku adjusted his backpack, stepping out of the alleyway and merging seamlessly into the bustling crowds of Muzurifu. He walked with his head held high, a ghost hiding in plain sight, completely unaware that his path was about to collide with the very god he worshipped, and that destiny was preparing to hand him the greatest power the world had ever known. The city of Muzurifu was a living, breathing organism. To the average citizen, its pulse was measured by the rhythmic clatter of the commuter trains, the flashing neon of the shopping districts, and the blaring sirens of hero agencies responding to the daily chaos of a superpowered society. But to Izuku Midoriya, the city had a different rhythm. Walking home from Aldera Junior High, navigating the labyrinthine concrete underpasses and shaded alleyways, Izuku perceived the world through a dual lens. The 14-year-old boy saw the vibrant hero billboards and the bustling crowds. The veteran shinobi felt the subtle shifts in air pressure, the echo of footsteps radiating off brick walls, and the microscopic fluctuations of ambient energy that painted a comprehensive tactical map of his surroundings. He was currently traversing a pedestrian tunnel, a dim, arched concrete thoroughfare that cut beneath the main transit line. The air here was perpetually damp, thick with the smell of stagnant water and mildew. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered rhythmically, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. Izuku walked with a casual, measured stride. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his black uniform trousers, his yellow backpack slung loosely over his right shoulder. He was replaying the confrontation with Katsuki Bakugo in his mind, analyzing the explosive boy's reaction to the Shenshin. He was rattled, Izuku thought, his eyes tracking the structural integrity of the concrete archway out of sheer habit. Katsuki relies entirely on intimidation and overwhelming frontal assaults. When faced with an opponent who simply isn't there, his combat loop breaks. He leaves his flanks wide open. It was a dangerous weakness. Against a competent villain, Bakugo's rage would be weaponized against him. Izuku sighed, his breath pluming slightly in the cool, damp air of the tunnel. I need to stop dissecting my classmates like enemy combatants, he reprimanded himself gently. This isn't the Third Shinobi World War. It's middle school. But the instincts were hardwired. The will of fire demanded that he protect his home, and to protect, one had to be prepared. Suddenly, the ambient noise of the tunnel shifted. The low hum of the traffic above was suddenly drowned out by a bizarre, wet, sucking sound. It was like thick mud being forced through a narrow pipe. The temperature in the tunnel seemed to drop by a degree. Izuku didn't stop walking, but his entire biological system shifted gears in a microsecond. The slouch of a tired student vanished. His muscles coiled. His breathing dropped from the upper chest into the diaphragm, drawing in oxygen to fuel the sudden flare of chakra pooling in his core. Behind his closed eyelids, the emerald green gave way to a bleeding crimson. He didn't turn around. He simply let his heightened senses do the work. The scent of raw sewage and rotting garbage assaulted his nostrils. He heard the squelch of viscous liquid hitting the pavement just 5 feet behind him. A medium-sized invisibility cloak. A voice gurgled. It sounded like it was speaking through a mouthful of wet sand. What luck, you'll do nicely, kid. Izuku opened his eyes. The world slowed to a crawl. Through the reflection in a puddle of dirty water a few feet ahead of him, he saw the attacker. It was a mass of undulating, dark green sludge, devoid of a solid form, save for 2 bulbous, manic eyes and a jagged mouth filled with misshapen teeth. It was a fluid-type quirk mutation, highly resistant to blunt force trauma, incredibly dangerous in close quarters due to suffocation potential. The sludge lunged, expanding outward like a tidal wave of mud, aiming to engulf Izuku entirely. The normal reaction for a 14-year-old would be to freeze, to scream, to throw their hands up in a futile attempt to block the liquid mass. Izuku did none of those things. Target is fluid. Physical strikes are inefficient. Evasion and misdirection required. The sludge crashed down over the boy, swallowing him whole. The villain laughed, a bubbling, victorious sound. Don't fight it, kid. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds, then I'll have a nice new meat suit to hide from him. The villain tightened its grip, expecting to feel the thrashing, desperate struggles of a suffocating child. Instead, it felt something remarkably stiff and distinctly synthetic. With a soft poof, a small cloud of white smoke erupted from within the center of the sludge. The liquid collapsed inward, losing its volume. The villain blinked its massive eyes in confusion as it realized it wasn't holding a middle school boy. It was aggressively suffocating Izuku's yellow backpack. What the? The villain gurgled, the sludge contorting in absolute bewilderment. A bag? Where did the brat go? Up here. The villain's liquid form whipped around, its eyes tracking upward. Izuku Midoriya was crouched effortlessly on the curved ceiling of the concrete tunnel, 20 feet directly above the villain. He was hanging completely upside down, his black uniform shoes planted firmly against the damp concrete as if gravity had simply forgotten him. His posture was relaxed, one knee bent, his hands resting casually on his thighs. His eyes were closed, masking the spinning crimson tomo beneath his eyelids. Kawarimi no Jutsu. The body replacement technique. It was an academy-level skill in his past life, a basic application of high-speed movement and misdirection. He had swapped places with his backpack the exact millisecond the sludge had crested over his head, using chakra to adhere to the ceiling out of the villain's field of vision. How are you doing that? The sludge villain roared, frustrated and enraged by the bizarre quirk display. Get down here, you little freak! The villain reared back, gathering a massive tendril of sludge to whip at the ceiling. Izuku prepared to push off the concrete and engage, channeling chakra into his fingertips. A quick burst of fire style would dry out the sludge, neutralizing its mobility. But before Izuku could form the tiger seal, the manhole cover at the far end of the tunnel exploded outward. A massive shockwave ripped through the confined space, sending dust and debris flying. The sheer kinetic force of the impact rattled Izuku's bones, even from his perch on the ceiling. A colossal figure stepped out of the shadows, practically ducking to fit inside the pedestrian tunnel. He was an absolute mountain of muscle, clad in a tight white t-shirt and cargo pants. Golden blonde hair stood up in two prominent tufts, V-shaped like the ears of a rabbit. Fear not, citizen! A booming voice echoed, carrying a frequency that seemed to vibrate the very air. For I am here! Izuku's eyes snapped open. The red hue instantly vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed, emerald gaze of pure, unfiltered all might, the symbol of peace. The #1 hero. The man Izuku had idolized since he could comprehend what a hero was. The sludge villain recoiled in absolute terror. Shit! He tracked me. The villain abandoned the yellow backpack and lunged toward All Might in a desperate, panicked bid for survival, whipping a massive, jagged tendril of liquid at the hero's face. All Might didn't even flinch. He simply pulled back his right arm. Izuku, still clinging to the ceiling, watched the movement with his hyper-analytical eyes. Even without the Sharingan active, he could see the impossible physics of the hero's body. The muscle fibers contracting, the sheer, unimaginable kinetic energy pooling in the fist. It wasn't chakra. It was something entirely different. A raw, terrifying stockpile of physical power. Texas. All Might roared, stepping forward and throwing a straight punch into the empty air. Smash! The fist never touched the villain. It didn't need to. The atmospheric pressure in the tunnel condensed instantly. A localized hurricane erupted from All Might's knuckles. The wind pressure was so violently intense that it tore the sludge apart on a molecular level. The villain was quite literally blown into thousands of harmless, splattering droplets that plastered against the walls and ceiling of the tunnel. The backdraft hit Izuku a fraction of a second later. It was like being struck by a solid wall of air. Izuku had to actively flare his chakra to the soles of his feet just to maintain his grip on the ceiling, his uniform whipping wildly in the gale force wind. As the wind died down, All Might stood tall, his hands on his hips, laughing his signature, booming laugh. Ha ha ha! Justice is served. Slowly, carefully, Izuku cut the flow of chakra to his feet. He dropped from the ceiling, executing a flawless, silent mid-air rotation, and landed in a crouch on the pavement behind All Might. All Might spun around, clearly surprised to see the boy behind him. He looked up at the ceiling where Izuku had been, and then down at the boy. Ah! Excellent evasion, young man! All Might boomed, giving a massive thumbs up. I apologize for getting you caught up in my villain pursuit. But you handled yourself quite well. A wall-climbing quirk, I presume? Izuku stood up, dusting off his knees. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The 14-year-old fanboy inside him was screaming, desperate to ask 1,000 questions about the Texas Smash's aerodynamic drag coefficient. But the shinobi maintained control. Something like that, Izuku said politely, offering a respectful bow. Thank you for the assistance, All Might Sensei. Your response time is incredible. Just doing my civic duty. All Might laughed, though Izuku noticed the laugh sounded a fraction of a decibel weaker than his television broadcasts. All Might reached down, picking up 2 empty 2-liter soda bottles that had rolled out of a nearby grocery bag. With practiced efficiency, he began scooping the scattered remnants of the sludge villain into the bottles. Izuku walked over to his yellow backpack, which was completely soaked in foul-smelling slime. He grimaced, pulling out his charred notebook, volume 13, which had miraculously survived the sludge relatively unscathed. If you don't mind. Izuku held out the notebook and a pen. Could I get an autograph? Of course. A hero always has time for his fans. All Might took the notebook, his massive hand dwarfing the book, and scrawled a massive, 2-page signature with lightning speed. He handed it back. Stay out of trouble, young man. And keep developing that quirk. I will. Thank you. Izuku bowed again. All Might crouched down, his leg muscles bulging impossibly. Now, I must deliver this evildoer to the police. I am taking off. With a shockwave that cracked the pavement, All Might launched himself out of the tunnel and into the sky, rocketing over the city like a golden missile. Izuku stood at the edge of the tunnel, looking up at the sky. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had just met his idol. He had an autograph. It was the greatest day of his life, but as he watched the speck of All Might disappear over the skyline, Izuku's brow furrowed. He didn't need the Sharingan to notice it, but his combat instincts flagged the anomaly instantly. When All Might had launched himself, his trajectory had been perfectly calculated. But mid-ascent, there had been a microscopic hitch. A falter in the kinetic chain. For a fraction of a second, the hero's posture had contracted, as if a sudden, agonizing pain had spiked through his ribs. And in that fraction of a second, as All Might's arm twitched to clutch his side, one of the 2-liter soda bottles slipped from the pocket of his cargo pants. Izuku saw the bottle tumbling through the air, completely unnoticed by the soaring hero. It fell rapidly, disappearing behind the sprawling rooftops of the nearby shopping district. He dropped the containment unit, Izuku realized, his blood running cold. But it was more than that. Why did he falter? The number 1 hero doesn't just flinch mid-jump. There is a systemic failure in his physical vessel. He's hiding a catastrophic injury. The realization was terrifying. The invincible god of Musitifu was bleeding behind his smile. Izuku gripped his ruined backpack tightly. The sludge villain was free, somewhere in the crowded commercial district. With a flare of chakra, Izuku broke into a sprint, leaving the tunnel behind. He had to find that bottle. Tattoo Alley was a bustling, narrow street packed with arcades, street food vendors, and boutique shops. It was a popular hangout for middle and high school students. 10 minutes after All Might's departure, the alley had been transformed into a literal war zone. Black, acrid smoke billowed into the afternoon sky, blocking out the sun. The deafening roar of explosions echoed rhythmically, rattling the windows of the surrounding buildings. Sirens wailed in the distance, a chaotic symphony of panic and destruction. Izuku pushed his way to the front of the massive crowd of onlookers that had formed at the barricade tape. What he saw made his stomach plummet into his shoes. The shopping district was engulfed in flames. Storefronts were shattered, merchandise burning in the streets. And in the dead center of the inferno, the sludge villain had reformed. It was massive now, having absorbed water from the broken municipal pipes. But the villain wasn't alone. Trapped within the center of the undulating mud was a teenage boy. He was thrashing violently, his arms restricted, his face barely visible through the thick, suffocating liquid. But Izuku could see the familiar ash-blonde hair, and the explosions detonating wildly from the boy's trapped palms. Katsuki? The explosions Bakugo was setting off in his panic were only feeding the chaos, igniting the surrounding structures and keeping the pro-heroes at bay. Izuku scanned the perimeter. The pro-heroes were already on the scene, but they were entirely paralyzed. Death Arms, a hero with superhuman strength, was attempting to lift a piece of rubble to clear a path, but he couldn't get close enough without being scorched by Bakugo's misfiring explosions. Kamui Woods, the rising star of the hero world, was standing helplessly by the sidelines, his wooden arms utterly useless against the combination of fire and liquid. Empty Lady, the giantess, was trapped at the entrance of the alley. She only had 2 sizes, normal and gigantic, and a 2-lane street was too narrow for her to operate without crushing civilians. Backdraft was desperately trying to keep the flames from spreading to the crowd, completely occupied with damage control. It's no good. Death Arms shouted, shielding his face from the heat. None of us have the right quirks to deal with this. We can't get a grip on the villain, and the kids' explosions are keeping us out. We have to wait for someone with a suitable quirk. Wait. The word echoed in Izuku's mind, cutting through the noise of the explosions like a rusted blade. Izuku stared at the pro-heroes. They were standing there, waiting. While his classmate, was actively suffocating to death 50 feet away. The shinobi within him sneered in absolute disgust. Pro-heroes, Shursue's memories whispered cynically. They view combat as a puzzle of matching quirks. If the puzzle piece doesn't fit, they surrender the board. They have forgotten the fundamental truth of the battlefield. You do not fight with the perfect conditions. You fight with what you have, or you die. Izuku looked back at the villain. Katsuki's explosions were growing weaker. His eyes, usually burning with such ferocious, unyielding arrogance, were wide with an agonizing, primal terror. He was looking at the heroes, begging them with his eyes to save him. But they were waiting. Katsuki was dying. Izuku didn't make a conscious decision. There was no heroic speech in his mind, no rallying cry. There was only the cold, unyielding arithmetic of the will of fire. A life is in danger. I have the power to intervene. Therefore I must act. Izuku dropped his yellow backpack. It hit the pavement with a soft thud. He didn't yell. He didn't warn the heroes. He simply bent his knees, dropping his center of gravity. He drew on his chakra reserves, bypassing the safety limiters he usually kept in place to protect his untrained muscles. He flooded his legs with pure, concentrated spiritual energy. His calf muscles tightened to the point of immense, searing pain. Micro tears ripped through the fibers of his legs. He formed the half-ram seal with his right hand, hidden against his chest. "Hey, kid! Get back behind the tape!" A police officer yelled, finally noticing Izuku's posture. Izuku vanished. A sonic boom cracked through the alleyway, shattering the remaining glass of the nearby storefronts. The pavement where Izuku had been standing cratered instantly, a spiderweb of cracks radiating outward from the force of his departure. The shunshin. The body flicker. Pushed to the absolute limits of his 14-year-old body, it wasn't just a burst of speed. It was a localized warping of space through sheer velocity. To the crowd, to the pro-heroes, and to All Might, who was standing in the back of the crowd, clutching his bleeding side in his emaciated, skeletal form, cursing his own uselessness. It looked like a streak of green lightning had just arced through the alleyway. Izuku bypassed the 50 feet of burning rubble in less than a tenth of a second. He moved so fast that the roaring flames of Bakugo's explosions barely had time to register his presence. A microscopic layer of chakra coated his skin, acting as a momentary heat shield, preventing his uniform from instantly combusting as he passed right through a wall of fire. He materialized directly in front of the sludge villain. The sudden displacement of air from his arrival created a violent gust of wind, blowing the smoke and fire away from the immediate vicinity in a perfect circle. The sludge villain froze, its massive eyes widening as the green-haired boy simply appeared out of thin air. "You!" the villain gurgled, recognizing him from the tunnel. "How did you?" Izuku didn't give him time to finish the sentence. He raised his head, his face completely devoid of emotion. It was a mask of absolute, terrifying apathy. It was the face of an executioner. He opened his eyes. The emerald green was gone. The bleeding crimson had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't just a single tomo. The sheer emotional stress of the situation, the desperate need to save a life, mirroring the darkest moments of his past life, had forced an evolution. 2 black tomos spun violently around the pupil of each eye. The sludge villain made the fatal mistake of looking directly into those crimson eyes. Genjutsu Sharingan. Izuku pumped a massive surge of unreleased chakra directly into the optic nerve of the villain. He didn't cast a subtle illusion. He didn't try to trick the villain's senses. He hit the creature with a sledgehammer of psychic trauma. In the real world, less than a second had passed. In the mind of the sludge villain, reality collapsed. The burning alleyway vanished. The villain found itself suddenly suspended in a void of infinite, suffocating darkness. The sky above was a bleeding, apocalyptic crimson. The water it had absorbed turned to solid, freezing concrete. And then, from the darkness, a colossal, ethereal ribcage of emerald green energy materialized around the villain, trapping it in an unbreakable cage. Above the ribcage, 2 massive, floating red eyes, each containing 2 spinning tomo, glared down at the villain with the wrath of an ancient god. "Do not move." The voice didn't just echo in the villain's mind. It commanded the villain's very nervous system. The sludge villain's consciousness shattered. The sheer, overwhelming terror paralyzed every single motor function it possessed. The liquid mass lost all surface tension, turning instantly rigid, completely locked in a catatonic state of unimaginable fear. Back in the real world, the undulating sludge went completely still, freezing like a statue. The grip on Bakugo loosened. Izuku didn't hesitate. He reached into the rigid sludge, grabbing Katsuki by the collar of his uniform. Channeling chakra into his arms to temporarily enhance his physical strength, Izuku planted his feet, twisted his hips, and violently ripped Bakugo out of the suffocating mass. With a grunt of exertion, Izuku hurled the gasping, coughing Bakugo backward, tossing him completely out of the danger zone and into the waiting arms of the stunned pro-hero, Death Arms. The entire sequence, from Izuku dropping his bag to Bakugo landing in the hero's arms, had taken less than 3 seconds. The alleyway was dead silent, save for the crackling of the dying fires. The pro-heroes stared in absolute, dumbfounded shock. The crowd was speechless. Izuku stood alone in front of the paralyzed, towering mass of sludge. His chest heaved as he gasped for air. The strain of the Tsutomu Genjutsu and the max-power body flicker had completely drained his reserves. His calf muscles were screaming in agony, feeling like they had been shredded by glass. His right eye throbbed painfully, a thin trail of blood leaking from the tear duct and running down his cheek, a stark warning of the Sharingan's physical toll. He slowly deactivated the eyes, the crimson fading back to green. He swayed slightly on his feet, his vision blurring. Mission accomplished, Izuku thought, his mind fighting against unconsciousness. Hostage secured. Target neutralized. Suddenly, the rigid sludge began to tremble. Without Izuku maintaining the eye contact, the genjutsu was breaking. The villain, driven to absolute, homicidal madness by the psychic trauma, roared, "I'll kill you! I'll tear you apart!" The sludge reared up, forming a massive, tidal wave of liquid designed to crush the boy into a bloody paste. Izuku tried to move, to form the seal for a substitution, but his legs simply gave out. He fell to one knee, completely spent. He looked up at the descending wave of death, completely calm. I pushed too far. The vessel failed. But before the sludge could reach him, a shadow fell over the alleyway. I am pathetic. A booming voice shattered the silence. Izuku felt the sudden, immense displacement of air. He looked up, his blurry vision catching the towering, golden form of All Might standing directly between him and the sludge. The hero was bleeding from the mouth, steam radiating off his massive muscles, his face contorted in a mixture of profound shame and blazing fury. I told you to develop your quirk, young man, All Might roared, raising his right arm, drawing back a fist that seemed to gather the very light of the sun. Yet I, a pro-hero, stood by and watched you risk your life. I have to practice what I preach. All Might threw his arm forward. Detroit. Smash. It was not a punch. It was a localized natural disaster. The wind pressure generated by the strike was so exponentially powerful that it didn't just obliterate the sludge villain. It altered the atmospheric pressure of the entire city block. The shockwave tore through the alley, violently extinguishing every single fire instantly. Izuku was blown backward, skidding across the pavement until he crashed into the legs of Kamui Woods. He looked up at the sky. The sheer force of the Detroit smash had created an updraft so powerful that it punched a hole straight through the smoke and the clouds above. A moment later, it began to rain. All Might stood amidst the falling water, the scattered, defeated remains of the sludge villain painting the walls around him. The number one hero raised a fist in the air, victorious. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers. Izuku closed his eyes, letting the cool rain wash the blood and sweat from his face. Incredible. Absolute, overwhelming power. No tactics. No illusions. Just raw force. It was exactly what he needed. The aftermath was a bureaucratic nightmare. Once the sludge villain was securely collected, by the police this time, and the fires were confirmed extinguished, the paramedics and the pro-heroes descended upon the two middle schoolers. Bakugo was currently sitting on the back of an ambulance, an oxygen mask over his face. He was physically fine, but his pride was utterly shattered. Several pro-heroes, including Empty Lady, were praising his resilience and his powerful quirk, telling him he had the makings of a great hero. Bakugo ignored them all. His crimson eyes were locked onto Izuku, burning with a complex mixture of fury, humiliation, and an emotion he had never felt before, inferiority. Izuku was sitting on a nearby curb, a paramedic having just finished wrapping his calves in compression bandages to treat the torn muscles. He was not receiving praise. Death Arms and Kamui Wood stood over him, their expressions stern and scolding. "What you did was incredibly reckless, kid," Death Arms lectured, crossing his massive arms. "You charged into a hostile situation without a pro license. That's vigilantism. You endangered yourself and complicated our operation. We had the perimeter secured. We were waiting for the right moment." Izuku sat perfectly still. He looked at Death Arms, his emerald eyes cold and flat. "You were waiting," Izuku repeated, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Yes," Kamui Woods chimed in. "We were assessing the situation to ensure minimal casualties." "He was suffocating," Izuku stated, pointing a finger toward Bakugo. "The human brain begins to suffer irreversible damage after 3 minutes without oxygen. He had been submerged for approximately 2 minutes and 40 seconds by the time I intervened." Death Arms frowned, clearly taken aback by the boy's clinical tone. "Look, kid, we know it looked bad, but we are professionals." "If you are professionals," Izuku interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying, commanding weight of a battlefield commander, "then you know that in a hostage scenario, time is the only currency that matters. You didn't secure a perimeter. You created a viewing gallery for a murder. You allowed property damage and quirk incompatibility to dictate your engagement." The two pro-heroes stared at him, genuinely speechless. A 14-year-old boy with a bloody eye and torn leg muscles was lecturing them on tactical engagement. "I didn't complicate your operation," Izuku finished, slowly standing up despite the pain in his legs. "I completed it. Because if I had waited for your right moment, Katsuki Bakugo would be dead." Izuku didn't wait for a response. He bowed slightly, a gesture of empty, formal respect, and picked up his ruined yellow backpack. He turned and walked away, limping slightly into the gathering twilight, leaving the pro-heroes standing in stunned, uncomfortable silence. They knew deep down that the boy was absolutely right. The sun had fully set by the time Izuku reached his neighborhood. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the empty suburban streets. The adrenaline had completely faded, leaving him exhausted, aching, and deeply frustrated. He had saved Katsuki. That was the only victory. But he had exposed a terrifying fraction of his power to an entire crowd of people. He had broken his own rule of operating in the shadows. "DKU." Izuku stopped, letting out a tired sigh. He turned around. Katsuki Bakugo was jogging down the street behind him, his breathing heavy. He stopped a few feet away, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He looked furious, but there was a tremor in his voice that he couldn't completely suppress. "I didn't ask for your help," Bakugo spat, his voice rough. "I didn't need you to save me. I would have gotten out myself. Don't you dare think you're better than me just because you have some secret, freakish quirk you've been hiding. I'm still going to be the #1 hero. I owe you nothing." Bakugo didn't wait for a reply. He spun on his heel and stomped away, his posture rigid with defensive pride. Izuku watched him go, a small, sad smile touching his lips. He's terrified. Not of the villain, but of the fact that he was helpless. He needs to believe he's invincible. "You're welcome, Katsuki," Izuku whispered to the empty street. He turned to resume his walk home, but paused as he heard heavy, approaching footsteps. "I am here!" All Might literally burst out of a nearby side alley, striking a heroic pose under the street lamp. The sudden appearance was so jarring that Izuku instinctively flared his chakra, ready to substitute again. "All Might Sensei?" Izuku asked, bewildered. "What are you doing here? Did you need more autographs?" All Might laughed, but the laugh suddenly cut off into a violent fit of coughing. Blood sprayed from his mouth, and in a puff of white steam, the towering, muscular god completely deflated. Izuku's eyes widened slightly, though the shinobi within him had already calculated this possibility. Standing before him was not the symbol of peace. It was an emaciated, skeletal man wearing clothes 3 sizes too big for him. His eyes were sunken, his cheekbones sharp, and he looked like a strong gust of wind would snap him in half. The media was swarming. The skeletal man coughed, wiping blood from his chin. I had to slip away. Izuku stared at him. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. He simply processed the visual information, corroborating it with the falter he had seen earlier. A catastrophic injury, Izuku stated calmly. A respiratory system failure, or massive organ damage. It restricts your operational time limit. That's why you dropped the bottle. That's why you were standing in the crowd before the smash. All Might, Toshinori Yagi, froze. His sunken eyes widened in absolute shock. He had expected the boy to scream, to cry, to demand an explanation. He had not expected a clinical, completely accurate medical and tactical diagnosis from a middle schooler. You noticed all that? Toshinori asked, stunned. I pay attention, Izuku replied simply. Toshinori let out a long, heavy sigh, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to him. He leaned against a nearby telephone pole. You are a remarkably perceptive young man, Toshinori said, his voice quiet, stripped of the booming bravado of All Might. But I didn't come here to talk about my injuries. I came here to talk about yours. Toshinori looked at Izuku's bandaged legs. I heard what you said to the pro-heroes. You were harsh, but you were right. They were paralyzed by the situation. I was paralyzed by my own limits. Toshinori stepped forward, his expression growing intensely serious. Out of everyone there, the heroes, the police, and myself, you were the only one who acted. You, a young man with a body clearly not meant for that kind of speed, threw yourself into a lethal situation to save a life. Izuku looked down. My body is weak. I pushed too much power through vessels that couldn't handle it. It was a tactical risk. If you hadn't intervened, I would have died. But you didn't hesitate, Toshinori countered softly. You saw a life in danger, and your body moved before your mind could formulate an excuse. Izuku looked up, the words echoing deeply within his soul. It was the exact definition of the will of fire. To protect the village, to protect the innocent, without a single thought for one's own preservation. Top heroes, Toshinori continued, placing a skeletal hand over his heart, have stories about them from their school days. Most of their stories have one thing in common. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think. Toshinori looked at Izuku, his blue eyes piercing through the twilight. That was true for you today, wasn't it? Izuku's breath hitched. For 4 years, he had carried the weight of 2 lives. He had hidden in the shadows, fighting phantom wars, desperately trying to build a foundation to become a hero. He had been told by society that he was a defect, and by his past life that he was a weapon. But here, standing before him, the god of modern society was looking at him, truly looking at him, and seeing neither a defect nor a weapon. He saw a hero. Yes, Izuku whispered, the boyish vulnerability finally breaking through the shinobi's mask. Young man, Toshinori said, standing up straight. Even without the muscles, his presence was overwhelming. You can become a hero. Izuku fell to his knees. The tears he had suppressed for years, tears of relief, of validation, of overwhelming gratitude, finally spilled over, streaming down his cheeks and mixing with the dried blood from his Sharingan. He pressed his face into his hands, weeping openly on the pavement. Toshinori watched him for a moment, letting the boy release his emotions. Then, he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of destiny. You are worthy to inherit my power. Izuku's head snapped up, his tear-filled emerald eyes wide with confusion. Inherit your power? My quirk, Toshinori explained, a small, proud smile forming on his skeletal face. It is not a natural mutation. It is a sacred torch, passed down from generation to generation, a power cultivated to defeat evil and protect the innocent. I was quirkless once, just like you, before it was given to me. Izuku's mind raced. A transferable power? A stockpiling of raw, physical energy? The tactical implications were staggering. If he possessed that level of raw physical power, combined with the perception of the Sharingan, and the speed of the body flicker, he would be virtually unstoppable. He could become a god of the battlefield. But he didn't want to be a god of the battlefield. He looked at Toshinori, seeing the toll the power had taken on the man's body. It was a power that demanded everything. It was a power meant for a symbol. "The name of my power," Tashinori said, raising his hand toward the night sky, "is one for all." Tashinori looked down at the boy kneeling before him. "I have been looking for a successor. Someone with the heart of a true hero. Will you accept my power, Izuku Midoriya?" Izuku Midoriya wiped the tears from his eyes. He slowly stood up, ignoring the agonizing pain in his torn calf muscles. He stood straight, locking his emerald eyes with Tashinori's blue ones. The shinobi and the fanboy were in perfect alignment. He had the eyes that saw the truth. He had the spirit of sacrifice. Now, he was being offered the physical vessel to change the world. Izuku bowed deeply, a perfect, formal gesture of absolute loyalty. "I accept, Sensei. I will carry your fire." Power, in the modern era, was viewed purely as a genetic lottery. It was a physical manifestation of biology, an extra organ, a mutated strand of DNA. It was external, loud, and inherently unbalanced. A man could be born with the power to level a city block, yet possess the fragile, easily broken body of a standard civilian. The power did not care about the vessel, it simply existed. Chakra was different. Chakra was the perfect, harmonious marriage of the physical and the spiritual. It was a discipline woven into the very fabric of the soul, requiring equal parts physical stamina and mental fortitude. It could not be given. It could not be stolen. It had to be forged in the crucible of absolute, unwavering dedication. For the 10 months following his fateful encounter with the sludge villain, Izuku Midoriya dedicated himself to the forge. The stage for this transformation was Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. Once a pristine coastline, it had devolved over the decades into an illegal dumping ground, a sprawling, festering labyrinth of rusted appliances, crushed vehicles, and jagged scrap metal. The stench of rotting kelp and oxidized iron was oppressive. Tashinori Yagi, in his emaciated, skeletal form, stood on the seawall overlooking the metallic wasteland. He wore a baggy yellow trench coat that fluttered in the crisp morning breeze. In his hands, he held a meticulously drafted packet of papers titled The Aim to Pass, American Dream Plan. It was a grueling, 10-month physical conditioning regimen designed to break a human body down and rebuild it with the muscle density required to hold the explosive, bone-shattering power of One for All. Tashinori looked down at the paper, and then looked out at the beach. He blinked his sunken blue eyes, rubbed them, and looked again. It was only month 3 of the 10-month plan. According to Tashinori's calculations, young Midoriya should have barely cleared a 50-square-foot radius near the shoreline. He should be struggling to drag a single microwave through the deep, unforgiving sand. Instead, Tashinori was watching a 14-year-old boy dismantle a small mountain of scrap metal with the terrifying efficiency of an industrial assembly line. Izuku was shirtless, his torso slick with sweat in the cool dawn air. He wasn't the frail, trembling boy he had been a season ago. The grueling labor, combined with his relentless, hidden chakra exercises, had completely redefined his physique. He was lean, coated with dense, incredibly defined muscle that looked like tightly wound steel cables beneath his skin. But it wasn't his physique that had Tashinori utterly bewildered. It was his methodology. Izuku was not dragging the trash. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic. Resting on his shoulders was a massive, rusted steel I-beam that had to weigh easily over 400 pounds. Slowly, deliberately Izuku squatted down, the sand shifting beneath his bare feet. He held the posture at the absolute lowest point of tension, his muscles trembling slightly, and then pushed back up. He's using it as a barbell, Tashinori realized, his jaw slackening. That's physically impossible. His muscle mass does not correlate to the kinetic output required to lift that beam. Where is the leverage? Where is the anchor? Tashinori watched closely. He noticed a faint, almost imperceptible blue distortion rippling around Izuku's bare feet, anchoring him to the shifting sand as if he were bolted to bedrock. Young Midoriya! Tashinori called out, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Izuku opened his eyes. He didn't flinch or drop the weight. He smoothly turned his head, his emerald eyes locking onto his mentor. With a controlled exhale, Izuku tilted his shoulders, allowing the massive I-beam to slide off. But instead of letting it crash into the sand, Izuku caught the edge of the beam with one hand, guided its momentum, and set it down with a soft, controlled thud. He wiped the sweat from his brow and jogged up the concrete stairs to the seawall, not even slightly winded. "Good morning, Tashinori-sensei," Izuku greeted, bowing respectfully. Tashinori coughed into his fist, pointing a skeletal finger at the I-beam. "My boy. I am not a physicist, but I am fairly certain I just watched you casually squat the equivalent of a small car. And last week, I distinctly remember seeing you retrieve a washing machine from the ocean, by walking on top of the water." Izuku offered a small, sheepish smile, scratching the back of his neck. "You told me you were quirkless," Tashinori pressed, his tone not angry, but profoundly confused. "When you saved young Bakugo with that burst of speed, I assumed it was sheer adrenaline. But what you are doing down there, it's a quirk, isn't it? A telekinetic tactile enhancement? Some form of gravity manipulation?" Izuku looked out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the shore, a steady, rhythmic drumbeat. He had spent the last 3 months debating how much to tell the number one hero. He couldn't explain the reincarnation. Explaining that he was the vessel for a dead ninja from a parallel dimension who had pulled his own eye out to stop a civil war was a bridge too far. It would make him sound legally insane, but Tashinori was offering him the greatest power in the world. He deserved a degree of honesty. "It's not a quirk, sensei," Izuku said softly, his voice shifting slightly, taking on that calm, ancient cadence that always made Tashinori feel like he was speaking to a man twice his age. "Not a quirk?" Tashinori frowned. "Then what is it?" "It's called chakra," Izuku explained, turning to face his mentor. "It's a discipline. An internal energy created by perfectly mixing the physical stamina of the body with the spiritual energy of the mind. Anyone could theoretically use it, but the knowledge has been lost to time. I discovered it. I've been cultivating it in secret for years." Tashinori stared at the boy. If anyone else had said it, the hero would have laughed. But looking into Izuku's deep, unwavering green eyes, Tashinori felt a profound sense of truth. "So, this chakra," Tashinori mused, stroking his chin. "It allows you to enhance your physical strength? To walk on water? It's an energy source. I can route it to my muscles to increase their tensile strength, or to the soles of my feet to adhere to surfaces," Izuku explained, demonstrating by pressing his palm against the vertical concrete of the seawall, and casually leaning his entire body weight backward, suspended perfectly parallel to the ground before righting himself. Tashinori's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. "Incredible. It's like a highly versatile, conscious energy manipulation. But young Midoriya, if you have this power, why do you need one for all? You're already incredibly strong. With this chakra, you could easily pass the UA entrance exam." Izuku's expression darkened slightly. He looked down at his own hands. "Because chakra is a multiplier, sensei," Izuku said, the memory of Shisui's tactical limitations bleeding into his voice. "It enhances what is already there. If my base physical strength is a 1, chakra can make it a 10. But the energy required to maintain that multiplier drains my stamina rapidly. I can move faster than sound, yes, but doing so tears my muscle fibers to shreds. My body is a glass cannon." Izuku looked back up, his eyes burning with absolute resolve. "One for all is a stockpiling quirk. It is raw, absolute physical mass and power. If one for all becomes my base, if my physical vessel is fundamentally upgraded to 100, Tashinori gasped, his strategic mind instantly catching up to the boy's terrifying arithmetic. "Then your chakra will multiply the 100. You won't just be strong. You will be utterly unstoppable." "I don't want to be a ghost who fights from the shadows," Izuku said, the will of fire burning brightly in his chest. "I want to be a pillar. I need a foundation that won't crack under the weight of the world. One for all is that foundation." Tashinori felt a shiver run down his spine. The sheer tactical genius, the profound understanding of his own limitations, the absolute dedication. This boy was a prodigy the likes of which the world had never seen. Tashinori smiled, a genuine, blinding expression that looked bizarre on his skeletal face. He reached out and ruffled Izuku's unruly green hair. "Then we had better finish building that foundation, young man." Back to work. The months bled together, tracked only by the changing of the seasons and the rapidly receding tide of trash on Dagoba Beach. Autumn brought chilling winds and freezing rain, turning the sand into a sluggish, muddy trap. Winter brought frost that coated the rusted metal in a layer of slippery, dangerous ice. Izuku welcomed it all. The environmental hazards were perfect for honing his chakra control. He practiced his surface adhesion constantly, moving heavy appliances over patches of black ice without slipping a single millimeter. By the 6th month, the dynamic between master and student had fundamentally evolved. They were no longer just moving trash. Tashinori, recognizing that Izuku's physical conditioning was vastly exceeding the timeline, initiated combat training. A hero must know how to fight without relying entirely on their quirk. Tashinori announced one brisk afternoon, slipping into a loose martial arts uniform. I am going to teach you the fundamentals of close-quarters brawling. Izuku, standing across from him on a cleared patch of pristine white sand, bowed respectfully. He dropped into a stance that made Tashinori pause. It wasn't a boxer's stance. It wasn't judo or karate. Izuku stood bladed, his knees slightly bent, his dominant hand resting near his chest while his offhand was extended forward, fingers slightly curled. It was a stance completely devoid of tension, yet coiled like a viper. It was the standard taijutsu interceptor stance of the Uchiha clan. Whenever you are ready, sensei, Izuku said softly. Tashinori, underestimating the boy, lunged forward with a standard, sweeping right hook. It was slow, meant to be blocked and countered. Izuku didn't block it. Blocking meant absorbing kinetic energy. Shinobi did not absorb energy. They redirected it. As the massive, skeletal fist approached his face, Izuku pivoted his front foot entirely on the ball. He slipped inside the arc of the punch, completely bypassing Tashinori's guard. Before Tashinori could even register the miss, Izuku's palm was resting lightly against the center of Tashinori's chest. If Izuku had flared his chakra, the strike would have shattered the hero's sternum. Dead, Izuku murmured softly, pulling his hand back and resetting his stance. Tashinori froze, his eyes wide. He hadn't even seen the boy move. It was a flawless, economic use of motion. No wasted energy, no telegraphed wind-up. Remarkable, Tashinori breathed, stepping back. Again. Faster this time. For the next 2 hours, the number 1 hero received a masterclass in ancient assassination taijutsu from a 14-year-old boy. Tashinori tried grapples, feints, and wild brawling tactics. Izuku dismantled every single one. The boy fought like water, yielding when struck, flowing around defenses, and crashing down with terrifying precision when an opening presented itself. They eventually collapsed onto the sand side by side, staring up at the slate-gray winter sky. Young Midoriya, Tashinori panted, rubbing a bruised rib. Where did you learn to fight like that? It's ruthless. It's designed strictly for lethal neutralization. Izuku stared at the clouds, the phantom memories of war and bloodshed washing over him. The smell of burning forests. The metallic tang of blood in the rain. In my mind, sensei, Izuku answered truthfully, though he knew Tashinori wouldn't understand the full depth of it. I close my eyes, and I fight phantoms. I fight the worst-case scenarios. I fight to ensure that when the time comes to protect someone, my body knows exactly what to do. Tashinori turned his head, looking at the boy's profile. There was a profound sadness in Izuku's eyes, a weariness that belonged to a veteran of 100 wars. You carry a heavy burden for someone so young, Tashinori said softly. My master, Nana Shimura, she used to say that a true hero smiles to hide the fear inside, to trick the fear. But you don't smile when you fight. You become completely empty. Emotion is a liability in combat, sensei, Izuku replied, Shursui's logic taking the helm. Anger makes you predictable. Fear makes you hesitate. To save a life, the mind must be a calm surface of water, reflecting only what is happening in the exact moment. The smile comes after the danger has passed. To reassure the survivors, Tashinori lay quietly on the sand. He had expected to teach this boy how to throw a punch. Instead, the boy was teaching him the philosophy of a warrior. I chose correctly, Tashinori thought, a profound sense of peace washing over him. Nana. I found him. The one who will end this. Month 10 arrived with the blossoming of the cherry blossoms. The morning of the UA entrance exam was crisp and clear. The sun rose over the eastern horizon, casting a brilliant, golden light across the Goba Municipal Beach Park. For the first time in over a decade, the ocean waves crashed against pristine, sparkling white sand. The rusted mountains of appliances were gone. The shattered glass was swept away. The beach was a flawless crescent of nature, completely restored by the hands of a single, determined boy. Toshinori Yagi stood at the edge of the seawall, looking out at the glittering ocean. Behind him, Izuku Midoriya let out a long, shuddering breath. Izuku's transformation was absolute. The boy who had been pushed off a cliff by his bully was dead. Standing on the seawall was a young man forged of iron and chakra, his green hair whipped in the wind, his jaw set with unwavering determination. Beneath his simple white t-shirt, his muscles were coiled, primed, and perfectly calibrated. "You finished early, young Midoriya," Toshinori said, turning to face him. 10 months. You cleared the entire beach, not just the designated zones. You pushed past the absolute limit. It was a good warm-up, sensei, Izuku replied, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his face. Toshinori laughed, the sound carrying over the roar of the ocean. He suddenly flexed his entire body. Steam erupted from his skin, his muscles expanding with violent, explosive force until the towering, golden form of All Might stood before Izuku. "You have proven yourself physically, mentally, and spiritually, young man." All Might boomed, his voice vibrating with immense pride. "You have forged the vessel. Now, it is time to receive the fire." All Might reached up to his head. He grasped one of his signature, golden tufts of hair, and plucked a single strand. He held the hair out toward Izuku. The morning sun caught the golden strand, making it glimmer like a wire of pure light. "This power has been passed down through generations. 8 people before me have cultivated it, nurtured it, and died for it. It is the crystallization of hope," All Might said, his booming voice softening into a tone of absolute reverence. "Eat this." Izuku blinked. The profound, sacred atmosphere shattered like glass. "Eat it?" Izuku asked, his emerald eyes twitching. "Well, yes. You have to ingest some of my DNA for the transfer to work. A hair is the most hygienic option on short notice." All Might laughed heartily. "Come now, young Midoriya. Destiny awaits." Izuku stared at the hair. The shinobi within him recoiled slightly at the idea of blindly ingesting foreign genetic material. But he knew the mechanics of quirks were bizarre and often defied conventional logic. With a deep breath, Izuku reached out and took the golden strand. He popped it into his mouth, chewed grimly on the coarse fiber, and swallowed hard. For a terrifying 5 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. "Did it work?" Izuku asked, frowning. "It takes time for the DNA to be digested and integrated into your system," All Might explained, deflating back into his skeletal form with a puff of steam. "You likely won't feel anything for a few hours. The timing is a bit tight, but it should manifest during the practical exam. Now go! Go home, shower, and get to Yue High. Your future begins today." Izuku bowed deeply, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Toshinori-sensei. For everything." Izuku turned and began to jog toward his apartment. As he ran, his internal sensors were flared to their absolute maximum. He was waiting for the spark. 20 minutes later, while standing under the hot water of his shower, he felt it. It did not feel like a quirk. Deep within his stomach, precisely at the center of his chakra pathway system, the Hashiman, the gateway of the core, a drop of energy materialized. To Izuku's hypersensitive spiritual perception, the energy was overwhelming. It was not a chaotic, volatile force like Katsuki's explosions. It felt ancient. It felt like a dense, heavy star that had been compressed into a microscopic point. It radiated a terrifying, unimaginable heat. The moment the spark of One for All touched his chakra network, Izuku's entire body seized. He fell to his knees in the shower, gasping for air as the water cascaded over his back. His chakra, which he had spent 4 years meticulously calming and controlling, reacted violently to the foreign invader. It flared, rushing toward his core like white blood cells attacking a virus. But One for All was not a virus. It was a king arriving at its throne. The raw, stockpiled energy pushed back against the chakra. The two forces slammed into each other, intertwining, twisting like a double helix of spiritual DNA. Izuku's skin flushed deep red. The water hitting his shoulders instantly vaporized into steam. In his mind's eye, his emerald eyes bled into crimson. The Sharingan activated on its own, the single tomos spinning wildly before splitting into two. The dojutsu was attempting to analyze and regulate the massive influx of energy. Control it, Shisui's voice echoed sharply in his mind. It is too dense. If it expands uncontrollably, it will shatter the vessel. Bind it with release. Suppress the output. Izuku clamped his hands over his stomach. He focused all his mental fortitude, dragging the wild, untamed energy of one for all into the rigid, disciplined pathways of his chakra network. It was like trying to force a raging river through a garden hose. Slowly, agonizingly, the pressure stabilized. The roaring star in his chest dimmed into a steady, pulsing ember. Izuku collapsed onto the tile floor of the shower, panting heavily. The water slowly cooled his overheated skin. He raised his hand. He didn't activate the power, but he could feel it resting there, just beneath the surface. It was a terrifying, beautiful monster waiting to be unleashed. Two wills, Izuku whispered, closing his eyes. One body. The campus of UA High School was a monument to superhuman society. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern fortress of glass and steel, imposing and magnificent. Izuku walked through the towering front gates, wearing his black middle school uniform. Around him, hundreds of teenagers buzzed with nervous energy, their quirks occasionally flashing or sparking in their excitement. Izuku felt completely disconnected from the noise. He was acutely aware of the ember of one for all burning in his chest. It was making him hypervigilant, his chakra network constantly humming with a low-level vibration. He needed to be careful. He hadn't tested the power yet. Lost in his internal calibration, Izuku didn't notice his foot catching the edge of a raised paving stone. His center of gravity shifted. He pitched forward, bracing for the inevitable faceplant onto the concrete. Before his hands could touch the ground, his descent abruptly halted. Izuku hung suspended in midair, a few inches off the ground. He blinked, instantly flaring his chakra to analyze the situation. He felt a sudden, localized absence of gravitational pull surrounding his entire body. It wasn't his chakra doing it, it was an external force. Are you okay? Izuku felt a gentle touch on his shoulder, and suddenly gravity reasserted itself. He dropped lightly to his feet, turning around. Standing behind him was a girl with short, bobbed brown hair and large, warm brown eyes. She wore a bright, friendly smile, though her cheeks were slightly flushed. Sorry I used my quirk on you without asking, she said, her voice bright and bubbly. But it would be bad luck if you fell right before the exam, right? Izuku's Sharingan remained dormant, but his shinobi senses analyzed her instantly. 5-point tactile activation. Localized gravity negation. Incredible utility for rescue and debris management. No hostile intent. High empathy markers. I thank you, Izuku said, offering a polite, slightly stiff bow. He wasn't entirely used to civilian girls talking to him without mocking him. Your quirk is remarkably efficient. You completely negated my mass with a single touch. The girl blinked, slightly taken aback by his analytical tone, but her smile widened. Oh. Thanks. I'm Ochako Uraraka. I'm super nervous, but let's do our best, okay? She gave him a cheerful wave and jogged off toward the auditorium. Izuku watched her go, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. Uraraka. A good ally to have on a battlefield. Get out of my way, Deku. The familiar, gravelly voice shattered the moment. Izuku didn't turn around. He simply shifted his weight, sidestepping smoothly as Katsuki Bakugo stomped past him. Bakugo glared at him from the corner of his eye, the hostility rolling off him in waves. Ever since the incident with the sludge villain, Bakugo had avoided Izuku entirely, communicating only through lethal glares and aggressive posturing. Good morning, Katsuki, Izuku said calmly. Bakugo just scoffed, shoving his hands deep into his pockets and marching toward the building. The written exam was a triviality. Izuku's mind, bolstered by the analytical processing speed of a shinobi and years of obsessive studying, tore through the advanced mathematics and hero laws in half the allotted time. The orientation for the practical exam was held in a massive, darkened auditorium. The voice hero, President Mike stood at the podium, projecting his voice at deafening decibels to explain the rules. It was a standard search and destroy simulation. 4 types of robotic villains, 1-pointers, 2-pointers, 3-pointers, and a massive 0-pointer obstacle, were scattered across a faux city landscape. The goal was to accumulate points by destroying them within a 10-minute time limit. Izuku sat quietly, memorizing the silhouettes of the robots displayed on the screen behind President Mike. They are machines, Izuku analyzed. Machines have joints. They have sensors. They have power cores. They rely on predictable algorithms. Blunt force is inefficient. Precision strikes to critical infrastructure are required. An hour later, Izuku stood before the colossal metal gates of Battle Center B. He wore a simple green tracksuit, his hands wrapped in white athletic tape. He had brought nothing else with him. He looked around the crowd of nervous applicants. He spotted Uraraka doing stretches nearby. He noticed a tall boy with engines in his calves lecturing someone about the rules. Right, let's start. President Mick's voice echoed from a loudspeaker atop a watchtower. The massive gates slowly began to groan open. The crowd of applicants hesitated, waiting for a countdown. Shinobi, do not wait for a countdown. The moment the gap in the gates was wide enough for a human body, Izuku flared his chakra to his calves. He shot forward, a blur of green and white, bypassing the stunned crowd entirely. By the time the gates were fully open, Izuku was already a block deep into the faux city. What are you waiting for? President Mike yelled over the speakers. There are no countdowns in real battles. Run, run, run! The crowd surged forward in a panic, but Izuku was already engaging. He rounded a corner, and came face to face with a 1-pointer. The green, mono-wheeled robot locked its optic sensor onto him. Target acquired, the robotic voice droned, raising a mechanical arm. Izuku didn't slow down. He didn't activate one for all. He kept the stockpile strictly suppressed. He was terrified that if he unleashed it without understanding its output, the blowback would shatter his limbs before he could even score a point. Instead, he relied on the discipline that had kept him alive in a past life. Izuku sprinted directly at the machine. As the robot swung its heavy arm, Izuku slid on his knees across the pavement, perfectly ducking under the strike. As he slid past the robot's base, his hand shot out, grabbing a discarded piece of reinforced steel rebar that was lying amidst some decorative rubble. He flipped to his feet, pivoting sharply. The robot was turning to face him. Izuku channeled a burst of chakra into his arms, drastically multiplying his physical strength, and hurled the rebar like a javelin. The steel rod whistled through the air and struck the robot perfectly in the center of its optical sensor, burying itself deep into the machine's primary processing unit. Sparks erupted in a violent shower. The robot shuddered, its single red eye flickering out, and collapsed backward into a heap of scrap metal. 1 point, Izuku thought, not even breaking his stride. He leaped onto the hood of a parked car, using it as a springboard to vault onto a fire escape, taking to the high ground. For the next 7 minutes, Izuku became a phantom. The judges sitting in the observation room of UA High watched the monitors in absolute bewilderment. Who is applicant number 7111? The principal, a white-furred creature named Nizu, asked, sipping a cup of tea as he watched screen 4. The screen showed Izuku Midoriya leaping from a rooftop, landing squarely on the shoulders of a 3-pointer robot. Before the machine could react, Izuku ripped a panel off the back of its neck with his bare hands, reached in, and violently severed the main hydraulic line. He flipped off the machine as it sparked, and crashed to the pavement. Izuku Midoriya, a tired voice answered. Shota Aizawa, the Erasure hero, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. Registered as quirkless. But his physical outputs are superhuman. He hasn't used a single flashy energy blast or mutation. He's just brutally efficient. He moves like a trained killer, the R-rated hero, Midnight, noted with a shiver. He's going strictly for the joints and sensory arrays. He's accumulated 45 points using nothing but found objects and bare-handed takedowns. Tashinori Yagi, sitting in the back of the dark room in his skeletal form, watched the screen with immense pride, but also a sliver of concern. Young Midoriya, you still haven't used the power. Are you afraid of it? You can't rely on your chakra forever. The physical toll will catch up to you. Back in the battle center, Tashinori's fear was proving accurate. Izuku landed in an alleyway after destroying a two-pointer, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He leaned against a brick wall, his right arm trembling violently. He had 45 points. A passing grade, undoubtedly. But the physical cost was mounting. Ripping steel plating with his bare hands, even enhanced by chakra, was tearing the ligaments in his fingers and stressing his joints. The energy of One for All, sitting in his core, felt like a caged beast, demanding to be let out, pushing aggressively against his chakra pathways. The internal pressure was causing a crippling migraine. 2 minutes remaining. President Mike announced over the city. Izuku closed his eyes, massaging his temples. Maintain control. If I let the energy spike now, my exhausted muscles will rip themselves apart. I just need to survive the final 2 minutes. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet violently shuddered. It wasn't a small tremor. It was a massive, localized earthquake that rattled the windows of the full buildings and sent dust cascading from the rooftops. A deafening, mechanical roar echoed through the city, followed by the sound of crumbling concrete. Izuku pushed himself off the wall, rushing to the end of the alleyway and looking down the main street. The sun was blotted out. Rising from the center of the city, easily towering over the 5-story buildings, was the zero-pointer. It was a colossal, olive-green leviathan of steel and treads. Its massive fist swung lazily, completely obliterating a building in a shower of debris and dust. The obstacle, Izuku breathed, his eyes widening. The logic of the shinobi kicked in instantly. Target is massive. Armor density is impenetrable to current physical outputs. Threat level, absolute. Objective, evasion and retreat. The other applicants in the street reached the exact same conclusion. A wave of terrified teenagers began sprinting in the opposite direction, fleeing the towering behemoth. Izuku turned to join them. There was no tactical advantage to engaging. It was worth 0 points. Ow! The cry was faint, barely audible over the roaring of the machine's treads, but Izuku's chakra-enhanced hearing caught it. He stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head, his emerald eyes scanning the chaos. Through the thick cloud of dust kicked up by the falling debris, Izuku saw her. Uraraka. She was trapped on the ground, a massive chunk of concrete pinning her right leg to the pavement. The zero-pointer was advancing down the street, its massive treads rolling relentlessly forward. In less than 30 seconds she would be crushed. The other applicants kept running. They didn't see her. They were blinded by their own survival instincts. But Izuku saw her, and in that singular, defining moment, the two halves of his soul slammed together in absolute, perfect unison. Shisui Uchiha had faced down the Nine Tails. He had stood before armies. He had sacrificed his own eyes to protect his village. The will of fire did not retreat when a comrade was in danger. Izuku Midoriya wanted to be a hero who saved everyone with a smile. He wanted to be the pillar of hope. Izuku didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk to his own body. He simply reacted. He turned away from the fleeing crowd. He planted his right foot firmly onto the cracked pavement. If my chakra is not enough to break it, Izuku thought, his expression morphing into a mask of absolute, terrifying focus, then I will use the king. Izuku released the lock on his core. He let the heavy, burning star of One for All flood into his chakra network. The two energies collided violently, but this time, Izuku didn't suppress the stockpile. He guided it. He used his immense, masterful chakra control to coat the raw, volatile power of One for All, routing it forcefully through his entire circulatory system. The physical manifestation was instantaneous and explosive. A shockwave of pure kinetic pressure erupted from Izuku's body, shattering the windows of the buildings on either side of the alleyway. Brilliant, crackling arcs of emerald green bioelectricity flared to life, dancing wildly across his skin, arcing from his hair and his limbs, scoring deep scorch marks into the pavement beneath his feet. In the observation room, the pro-heroes leaped out of their seats. What is that energy spike? Midnight gasped, staring at the monitor. He was holding back? Tashinori gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles turning white. He's doing it! He's using the power! But the output is too high. He's going to blow his arms off. Back on the street, Izuku felt like he was burning from the inside out. The sheer volume of power coursing through his veins was agonizing, intoxicating, and limitless. He looked at the towering zero-pointer. He looked at Uraraka, who was staring up at him in awe and terror. Izuku lowered his center of gravity. He formed the half-rammed seal with his right hand. He didn't just use the body flicker. He infused the Uchiha high-speed movement technique with the 100% raw output of One for All. Green lightning shunshin. The pavement beneath Izuku didn't just crack, it pulverized into a fine, powdery crater. A sonic boom shattered the air, a deafening crack that brought the fleeing applicants to their knees. Izuku did not run. He simply vanished. To the naked eye, a massive, jagged streak of green lightning arced from the ground, zigzagging upward through the falling debris, completely defying gravity. In a fraction of a millisecond, Izuku materialized in midair, directly in front of the massive, steel face of the zero-pointer. The sudden displacement of air from his arrival created a localized hurricane, blowing the dust cloud away entirely. Izuku pulled his right arm back. The green lightning concentrated around his fist, burning with the intensity of a dying star. Smash it! He threw the punch. Time dilated. The world slowed to an agonizing crawl. As Izuku's fist hurtled toward the thick steel plating of the robot's face, his Sharingan snapped awake. The two black tomos spun violently in a sea of blood-red crimson. The eyes that saw the truth looked at his own arm. Through the Sharingan's microscopic perception, Izuku saw the horrific reality of his action. He saw the sheer, unadulterated force of 100% One for All gathering in his knuckles. He saw the bones in his forearm beginning to groan under the pressure. He saw the muscle fibers preparing to snap like over-tightened guitar strings. If this punch landed at full power, the kinetic kickback would completely pulverize his right arm into a bloody, useless pulp. The shinobi survival instinct, honed over years of lethal combat, and perfected by the Sharingan's flawless chakra control, violently seized the reins of his body. In the exact microsecond before his knuckles made contact with the steel, Izuku forcefully clamped down on the output of One for All. Using in-release chakra, he slammed the floodgates shut, aggressively throttling the immense, stockpiled power down from 100% to a regulated, manageable 5%. The green lightning around his arm dimmed significantly, but the momentum and the baseline power remained. Impact. Izuku's fist struck the center of the zero-pointer's face. It wasn't the apocalyptic, weather-altering shockwave that All Might produced. It was a concentrated, highly focused transfer of kinetic energy. The 5% output, combined with the extreme velocity of the shunshin and Izuku's chakra-enhanced muscle density, struck the machine like an armor-piercing artillery shell. The steel plating caved inward instantly, shearing apart with a horrific, screeching sound. The sheer force of the blow traveled through the machine's internal structure, violently snapping its hydraulic spine. The colossal robot's red eyes flickered and died. The massive machine halted its advance, groaning under its own weight, before slowly, catastrophically tilting backward. The zero-pointer crashed to the ground, a mountain of defeated scrap metal, sending a massive plume of dust high into the sky. Izuku hung in the air for a brief moment, the green lightning fading from his skin. He looked down at his right arm. It was bruised, trembling violently, and aching with a deep, throbbing pain, but it was entirely intact. The bones were whole. I controlled it, Izuku thought, a surge of adrenaline washing over him. The eyes saved the vessel, but his victory was short-lived. Gravity aggressively reasserted its claim on him. Izuku was currently in a free fall, 200 feet above the pavement. His body was completely exhausted, his chakra reserves dangerously low from the shunshin, and the backlash of rapidly throttling One for All was making his vision swim. I need a landing strategy, Izuku thought, the ground rushing up to meet him. If I use surface adhesion, my legs will snap from the deceleration. I need the king. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut. He forcefully ignited the ember in his core once more, calling upon the 5% output. Green electricity crackled around his legs. Just as he was about to hit the pavement, he lashed out with a vicious, chakra-infused roundhouse kick aimed at the empty air beneath him. The 5% One for All strike generated a localized shockwave of wind pressure, acting as a cushion of air that drastically slowed his momentum. Izuku hit the ground, rolling flawlessly over his shoulder to disperse the remaining kinetic energy, and skidded to a halt mere feet away from Uraraka. He stayed in a crouch, his head bowed, panting heavily. The green lightning dissipated entirely. The red of his eyes faded back to emerald. The entire city was completely, utterly silent. Uraraka, still pinned beneath the rubble, stared at the back of the green-haired boy in absolute, terrified awe. She had just watched him shatter the laws of physics, obliterate a mechanical god, and fall from the sky like a green meteor. Time's up! Present Mix's voice echoed, breaking the spell. Izuku let out a long, exhausted breath. He slowly stood up, wincing as his muscles protested. He turned to Uraraka, offering her a tired, but genuine smile. "Are you alright, Uraraka-san?" he asked softly, kneeling down and casually gripping the massive chunk of concrete pinning her leg. With a slight flare of chakra, he effortlessly tossed the rubble aside. "Ah, you, the robot!" Uraraka stammered, completely